And I wonder, as you're thinking now, well, I'm curious what you're thinking now about your work, your career. I mean, obviously you cover a variety of stories, but as we're going into the new year, how are you thinking about what you want to focus your work on, what kind of stories you want to tell?
So I'm heading to Jerusalem tomorrow. So
Okay.
I'm gonna do Middle East cover for Christmas, and then I'm gonna come back. And there's already a series of things that we want to do in Africa. And a key thing is that I really want to do this thing on a more kind of micro level. So throughout my career, I spend time in Sudan, train in Sudan, and then I leave and I'm in London and I'm like getting training and then I get resources and I go back. And now I think it's this kind of thing in the bureau where it's like, yeah, we go to Sudan and we come out and then we spend time doing other stories and then we go to Sudan. And I think it's really good for me to just be able to not only step out, but to apply and what I've learned in Sudan in other places and vice versa, right? Because it's such a huge continent and it's so rich and it's so diverse. And I'm based in South Africa, but I go to Lesotho and I go to, any place in Southern Africa and it's completely different. And I need that. And I think that's really what I want to make sure I do more of next year. I mean, we started this year in the DRC in Goma as it was being captured by M23, and I want to follow up on the story in the DRC. I want to find out what's happening in Goma and in Eastern DRC in general. We want to go to Ghana for stories. There's a lot to do, and I think rather than it being pulled out of Sudan and the news kind of forcing me out, I want to actively
Yeah.
create that balance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because you mentioned you spent actually, you said a lot of your career freelance, and then you got into, can you talk about that a little bit?
So I moved back to Sudan when I graduated, and I was freelance for the first 2 years full when I was full time. And when I moved back to Sudan, it was really about for me, features, right? I was pitching feature after feature because Sudan had been very much like Darfur conflict, uh, al-Bashir's, South Sudan secession, al-Bashir's dictatorship. And I think once the South seceded and al-Bashir had a rigged election, it was kind of like everyone's like, oh, we know how this story goes. It's just another kind of doomed dictatorship. And so when I moved back, it was so much about reporting on really cool like community initiatives, people training Sudanese volunteers training sniffer dogs to find old World War II landmines, or artists in Sudan, this like cultural renaissance of underground artists becoming more and more open after such a repressive period for the art. So I was doing all this stuff and I feel like it really kind of set the tone for everything I do now, which is, like where's the fullness? How do we kind of flesh it out? What's under kind of the top line? But I did that and then I moved back to the UK and I started doing documentaries with Channel 4 and it was freelance. And then I worked with Vice News Tonight and I just felt like I needed to be freelance again and I needed to move back to Sudan. And I moved back in November 2018 and December 2018 the revolution started. So I was freelance initially, and then I was with Channel 4 News.
Mm-hmm.
And then I left Channel 4 News and I was freelancing again. And then I went to Sky.
And then you went to Sky. Okay. Okay. So yeah, it sounds like you were able to see sort of, I imagine you gained a lot of skills through freelancing, being able to sort of hustle and look for the stories that served you, um, being staff now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I just want to check if there are any questions from the audience, uh, before we let user go. Oh, sorry, I didn't see these. Um, we have a question from Chantel. As someone who has been covering the war in Sudan for 2 years, how do you think anti-Blackness and colorism play in the role of the war?
I mean, I think it's very it's very much a stereotype for African countries to deal with conflict. Like it's anti-black in the sense that it is seen to be like a fundamental part of the African story to deal with civil war and conflict. And I think that's something that we've been really working to, I'd say, dismantle, like this fatalism
Mhm.
um, that I think is ultimately racism, right? Because the revolution was a break in that story for Sudan. It was agency, it was democracy, it was so inspiring and beautiful, and it was brutal. The crackdown was nuts. Hundreds of young people lost their lives. But I think that's where we really, a lot of us, as a lot of the journalists who are into Sudan right now, were started getting into Sudan because of the revolution. And that for me was like, okay, this war it wasn't inevitable. It actually was going to, if it was an inevitable part of our story because of 20 years ago in Darfur, the revolution had the capacity to take us on a different track. And it was actively suppressed. And so I definitely feel like we just we don't get to have long histories. And I think that that is very much a discriminatory thing. It's not like people don't look at the war in Sudan the same way they would look at, World War II or any of these kind of glorified wars. They look at it as oh, the Africans are fighting again. And so I
Right.
definitely have been, really working with that. And it's across the continent, but it's across the global south. I mean, I think Yemen it doesn't get any proper coverage anymore. Um, and so, yeah, so that's one of the main ways that I've dealt with, I'd say, anti-Blackness. Colorism, I think we have internally dealt with colorism in Sudan, and that's the kind of tribalism and the Arab supremacy that we see the RSF
Yes.
wielding and using against people, and sort of the way that they target people, civilians based on ethnicity in their massacres. So it's not just an external colorism and racism, it's also our internal colorism
Yeah.
and racism that's been huge. And it also, I think, for me, was a big part of how we covered the war. So I didn't, I'm from Khartoum, but it was very much like trip to Khartoum or to Sudan, like central Sudan, then trip to Chad to cover the people leaving Darfur. And it always felt to me like it's not that this shouldn't even have to be an effort. This is how the war should be covered. But
Yeah.
I do feel like the pitfalls of covering Sudan through a very narrow perspective, which is just the kind of Arabized elite in Khartoum, is such a risk, and we've seen it before. And so I definitely wanted to make sure our coverage reflected the country. So that
Yeah.
was where we did a lot of internal travel, and that was where kind of getting into Darfur was so seminal when we finally got to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge because, yeah, not many people have been able to do it. They're covering it from chat, as you said. Um, and another question, Nick, hi, I have a question. I was in the Nuba Mountains a year ago. No one there thought that they would be part of an integrated Sudan again. Is there a way that that country stays together?
I think that the Nuba Mountains is still very much the rebellion there is so old and deep rooted that I don't see a track where the SPLM, the Sudanese people, the Sudan's People Liberation Movement North. Sorry, there's so many, there's so
Right.
many groups. But SPLM-N, led by Abdelaziz Al-Hulu, they control large parts of South Kordofan, right? And they have been dealing with counterinsurgency campaigns and bombings from Khartoum since 2013, basically since the South seceded and they were kind of left lumped with the North.
Mhm.
I think with Al Hilo, I mean, the rebel leader in that region has decided to partner up with the RSF, even though the RSF was pillaging and attacking cities in South Kordofan. And the reason he did that is because his contention and his roots of, you know, they've been marginalized by the centralized state for so long that he would rather deal with the RSF than join up with the government. So he had talks with both. and eventually chose the RSF predominantly for supply, weapon supply, but also because the RSF kind of work on that narrative that they are going to bring together all the marginalized groups in Sudan. They're the Arabs, the nomadic Arabs of Darfur who never got a stake to the land, and they were used by al-Bashir to uphold the state, but they were never actually given anything. That's why they felt the right to loot all of those homes in Khartoum. But the reality is they loot homes everywhere, you know. But this narrative that um, I think a big part of what I've been thinking is what makes a rebel, right? Because the RSF are now being called rebels, and they were tools of the state for 20 years,
Yeah.
and they're kind of using that to create a shared narrative with traditional rebels like South Kordofan and the Nuba Mountains. I think the point about the Nuba Mountains is what makes me really believe that the country will be fractured for a long period of time
Really?
because of how the RSF is capitalizing off of those really old, um, I wouldn't say conflicts, those old differences
Yeah.
that have never been settled. We have never had, in my opinion, seriously productive mediation in Sudan, grassroots mediation, community level mediation that then forces the rebel leaders at the top to then have to say, okay, well, my community wants us all to kind of be in harmony. It's never worked. I felt like when I read about these peace agreements and I look into these peace agreements, they all seem so technical, but not existential, like not actually the kind of like real heart to heart mediation that's required in these communities. And I think that is what makes me, I don't want to say resign, but makes me like question whether we will actually stay intact. Especially
Yeah.
because people on the ground in the Nuba Mountains, they have no choice right now. They don't want to be a part of the country, the military state, because they've been terrorized by them. The RSF is terrorizing them as well. But at this point, their leadership has decided that that's the partnership that he wants. And so the lack of even any sort of referendum or any,
Yeah.
political will is
Yeah.
really hard.